Everybody, thank you for joining this session over here of ours on urban water resilience for future peace, security, and social justice. My name is Anton Earl. I'm the Global Coordinator for Water Systems at ICLEI. ICLEI stands for Local Governments for Sustainability, and we work with around 2,500 local governments globally to support their pathways to sustainability. So we work with them across sectors such as energy, biodiversity, climate change, food systems, and increasingly, water. We like to think that local governments are really at the forefront of responding to climate change impacts. So when there are disasters such as floods, such as drought, such as food insecurity, it's most often the local governments that really have to respond to that. And we would like to see greater participation of local governments in the international and national level decision making so that they can shift from that reactive role into a more proactive role across these different sectors, water included. And the basic thesis for this session that you've chosen to join today is to hear about ways that local governments can get more actively engaged in regional water security initiatives from that regional dimension, specifically in Africa. But my experience globally shows that much of what we're experiencing in Africa, especially with the onset of climate change impacts, is relevant to most of the rest of the world. Now, I know we in the water community, we really like complicating things, and we make it sound terribly complex. What are the impacts of climate change going to be? How is it going to play out? But I always liked the way South Africa's first democratically elected Minister of Water, way back in the 1990s, Professor Kader Asmal, who was actually a professor of law, and lawyers are great, they just, they cut to the chase, the most simple definition that they can get to. But he always said, well, basically everything that you're telling me, it means that water is either too little, too much, or too dirty. And when I said this in a presentation to some of the mayors that we work with in our network a few months back, a couple of the mayors put up their hand, and the one even came back to me and said, well, you know what, in my city we have all three of these. And that's pretty much the same for most places in the world. And especially with climate change, we see that essentially cities are being impacted in that way. Now, when we start thinking about cities and their regional and international reach, it's actually something that in Africa and much of the rest of the world is already existing at large scale. So you see river basins like the Orange Senko, where there's a large-scale water transfer project that supplies water to around 14 million people through the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, meaning that people who live in a city like Johannesburg or Pretoria, from where I live, around 50% of their water coming out of that tap is tapped all the way from the Lesotho Highlands. And in the end, that water actually travels close to 400 kilometers to supply other cities to the north of Johannesburg. In the Limpopo Basin, there's the Molatedi Dam Transfer Project has been supplying water from South Africa to Botswana since the 1980s. A big water transfer from the Okavango to the city of Windhoek has been planned from at least the 1970s. It's not constructed yet, but advanced plans are there should they need that water to be transferred. Likewise, the Zambezi advanced plans for water to be brought south to cities over there. And of course, it's not only water, physical water, that's being transferred to these cities, it's electricity, it's food. For instance, the hydropower dam on the Zambezi, the Cahora Bassa Dam, supplies electricity to the urban areas around Johannesburg, around Pretoria, and a 1,500 kilometer transmission line has been built for that. So the precedent is there, and I think very often we're not aware of how far our water has to travel to reach our urban areas. And yet the voice of cities and other subnational governments are usually lacking in the international negotiations around water management. Just to also confirm, of course, I mentioned how cities are at the front line of responding to climate change. And of course, from at least the year 2010, more than half of the world's population resides in cities. In Africa, you have some of the fastest growing cities in the world. And essentially, as people become urbanized, there's also a stronger push, a political push, to ensure the meeting of their human right to water and sanitation. So that increase in the size of cities is doubled up with an increase in the political pressure to make sure that that population receive access to water. And of course, the way cities are constructed, we tend to pour concrete over natural water-related infrastructure. So your wetlands, your flood channels, your paleo channels of rivers and so forth, your floodplains, they get covered with conference centers, shopping malls, hotels, all the things that make modern city life manageable, right? So you're having less infiltration in those cities. The other thing, of course, is that the hydrological cycle has an impact. And we're all very familiar with these wonderful little pictures from high school days of the hydrological cycle. But one thing most of them have in common, they don't really show cities located in the hydrological cycle. They tend to just show the lovely mountain tops and the rivers going down, with a few exceptions. And it's interesting to see that, of course, a drop of water that lands on a mountaintop somewhere spends about 2 to 6 months traveling across land to get back to the ocean. That's more or less its journey time in rivers and lakes. If it gets into deep groundwater, of course, it can be a guest for longer than that on land, but typically 2 to 6 months. Once it's in the ocean, it takes around 3,200 years to return back into the freshwater cycle, meaning that as water managers, we've actually got a very, very small window of opportunity to slow down the hydrological cycle. So the speeding up with climate change of very rapid rainfall events, very large rainfall events, precipitation coming in a very short space of time, which is a trend that we are seeing in much of Africa, where rainfall has remained the same in many places, but it's falling in a very, very short space of time. Our ability to slow that down has been reduced. So we really need to think about how cities engage with water management within the city, and more importantly, outside of the city borders. So the catchments that serve them and the catchments that receive their effluent. That becomes more and more important. So we speak about slow water, having to invest in slow water. So using buffers, using nature, wetlands, for instance, other buffer zones to try and increase infiltration of water into the soil. Just to end off with, we at ICLEI work with our members, roughly 2,500 local governments, and one of the areas that we promote strongly is values. And I think this is very important when we're looking at issues of equity around water, the value of the human right to water and sanitation, the value of a healthy functioning ecosystem, and of course the value of water itself. Water has an economic value, but importantly, a social value, a cultural value, a religious value. All of these have to be recognized. Then, of course, your connections. I spoke about the connection of cities to their catchments, and that we're going to hear some interesting examples around that are emerging. But also connecting ecosystems, making sure that your wetlands and your floodplains and so forth are left intact. Connecting stakeholders to the decision-making processes, making sure that there is equity and access to those decision-making processes is important. Also connecting between sectors. We can't just hope to solve water issues by only working with water managers. We need to look at energy, food systems, health systems in a city. And then finally, investments, primarily investments in natural infrastructure, increasingly trying to get municipalities to value their natural infrastructure and include natural infrastructure in their municipal asset registers, just as they would a bridge or a dam or any other piece of concrete infrastructure. Because by doing so, you can actually ascribe a budget to that infrastructure for the operation and maintenance of that infrastructure. So it's very simple, relatively simple, low-hanging fruit right there. To illustrate a bit of this, we would like to hear from some of the voices on the ground. We are all incredibly privileged to either be joining over the Zoom link to this session, and welcome to our online audience, I should have said that first, or we are physically here in this room, in this beautiful city of Stockholm. And yet we want to hear about what's actually happening on the ground. So to give us a bit of an insight into that and to acknowledge that water management on a very local scale requires local solutions, our co-conveners of this session, one of the co-conveners with ICLEI, is WRI, and they've collated some of these voices from the ground. And with that, I'll ask for the video to start rolling, and we can take a look at that.
Mimi naitwa Beatrice Amis Ogada, miaka yangu ni 70. Nimeishi hapa tangu nikuja ni 35 years viwandani, na ndio mafuriko ilikuwa inatusumbua sana. Vitu vilienda, nikashindwa nitafanya nini. Nilikuwa nauza hapo nguo kidogo na njugu. Zote ziliendanga na nikabaki bure vile niko.
Nilikuwa naishi huko chini ya mto. Mafuriko ikakuja, nyumba ikaingia maji, vitu vikaharibika, so nikaona ina haja nikae huko, vitu zikiendelea na kuharibika.
In terms of the climate of shocks, the city experiences flooding, and this one has meant us as a city to reach out to potential partners. We have mapped the flooding zones, and I think we'll also be looking forward to partners to be able to, we digitize all that to ensure that people out there can be able to know which are these odd zones where we think flooding is likely to happen.
I think in order to obtain climate resilience, you must knock on every single door in an informal settlement. You must appreciate that every single household has its unique challenges. That mobilization must be done, and it must be done by the people themselves.
What communities want is basically solidarity. They have the solutions, they know what needs to be fixed, and our role as professionals or civil society is to mobilize that capacity for them.
In terms of preparing for climate shocks, the city has been able to come up with a climate action plan, which involves prioritizing actions on all the sectors which are aimed at cutting down emissions. We'll be looking forward into working with the communities to develop frameworks in terms of making those communities more resilient.
On the ground, the realities can be so startling, can be so shocking, can be so real. The frontliners in Rehouse are the real heroes of this work. And how we work with them, how we support them, how we equip them, the ecosystems of support that we create for them is really going to be the hallmark of success.
Jukumu letu sasa kwanza ni kuungana, si wenyewe, na tujiulize what next. Kwa sababu sasa hii huwezi kuja wewe mwenyewe useme utafanya hivi wewe mwenyewe, na kuna wengine bado lakini hawana hiyo mind yako. So lazima muungane, mjue way forward ili mtafanya.
Thank you to our partners at WRI for putting that together, because I think it just gives us a snapshot into some of the challenges being faced in Nairobi, of course, but it could also be any other city in any other part of the world dealing with that issue of too little, too much, too dirty water. One of the things that struck me there, the young man that spoke at the very end, he reflected in saying that you can't deal with this alone. You need to work in partnership. And that's part of the rationale for us as the co-conveners of this session. We are all organizations that are working in support of government-mandated entities, whether they be municipalities, water utilities, national water departments, that are all trying to realize their responsibility for supplying water and sanitation services. And it's in that process of providing that support that we've learned some lessons, we face some challenges, we've tried to overcome those, and we share those in this session. So we'll be hearing from some of our speakers that will introduce some of that thinking. So we've got speakers that come from Arup, from WRI, from Deltares, and from GWOPA, as well as the University of Montpellier, that will be sharing some of those reflections with us. And then importantly, I will invite you, the audience, to engage in that discussion. So once they've had a chance to speak, you'll have an opportunity to either pose them questions, difficult or otherwise, as you wish, or to give some of your experience, reflect on what you have heard. So it'll be an open discussion over there that we'll move along with. Before that, though, I've got a Menti poll, and I will invite you to get your phones out and engage on the Menti poll. Yeah, there we are. Straightforward question. And you can write it out over there. In what catchment or watershed do you live in? I'm hoping our online participants can also contribute to that. And we are all water management professionals, so I'm sure we all know exactly what catchment we live in, right? I'm not doing the Menti, but I live in the Limpopo, so hopefully that comes up as one of the options over there, the broader catchment that Pretoria finds itself in. So that's a really nice geography lesson for us. There's almost like as many catchments up there as people in the room, which is great. So a huge variety. And I see some of you really looking at your phones intently. So maybe you're even Googling to see what city you're actually living in, which is great when you've all learned something already in this session. Good. Let's move on to the next question. Here's where it gets technical. Who of you know how far, what's the longest distance water has to be transported to reach you in your home to flow out of your tap? Less than 50 kilometers, up to 100 kilometers, up to 500 kilometers. I think that's what I would have to tick, because a lot of my water comes from the Lesotho Highlands project, which I'm very grateful for. Anyone from Lesotho over here, I say thank you every morning I take a shower. Or more than 500 kilometers. Oh, no one going for the over 500 option there. No one here from Los Angeles, for instance, water coming from Lake Mead, 1,000 miles away or anything like that. All right, so most of us are sort of fairly close. Then the final question over here, keeping this in mind. Do you know if your city is actively engaged in managing that catchment where they draw the water from? So not just managing water in your city, I'm sure they're doing a good job of that, but are they actually managing the catchment far away? And it's just a yes, no, so we're not going too deep into that. To be honest, I was expecting this to be the other way around. This is great news that your city is actually engaged in managing the catchment, because a lot of the experience is that cities don't get very engaged actually in conserving the catchment, managing the catchment. So if they are, that's good practice. Let's hear more about that. But in many cases, there's maybe a lack of management or a disjuncture between the municipality and the utility that they receive water from. And it's just assumed that the utility keeps on providing water no matter what, and the utility will have to be responsible for that. So it's interesting to see this result. So that sets us up for our first keynote speaker, and I'll call on Louise Ellis, who's the Associate Director for Water Advisory and Asset Management at Arab. Louise, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anton, and an excellent Mentimeter poll. Definitely got the creative juices flowing this morning. Thank you all for having me here this morning. It's really great to be here talking about some of the work that we're doing in the urban water resilience space, particularly in participatory approaches to urban water resilience planning. Today I'm going to talk about two approaches that we've been using largely in Ethiopia. The first is the city water resilience approach, and the second is the Ethiopia water resilience diagnostic. Thank you. The city water resilience approach is being deployed at a city scale in Addis Ababa, and the water resilience diagnostic at the country scale. But firstly, just to set the context that Ethiopia faces, it's the second most populous nation in Africa and one of the fastest growing economies in the region. The Upper Awash Basin concentrates a high population of 8 to 10 million people, 60% of industries as well, and there's an insufficient and inefficient water supply system with which has driven an over-reliance of self-supply from groundwater. Like many cities around the world, the development ambitions set out in the 10-year plan don't align with the water and infrastructure capabilities, and as a result there is a demand-supply gap, and particularly becomes marked at the kind of 2030 stage. And so we've been working initially with Addis Ababa Water and Sewerage Authority on the city water resilience approach. It's a 5-step participatory approach that brings together stakeholders. Firstly, to just develop a shared understanding of what the challenges are, to understand the system, and by the system that's not just the physical assets, it's also the natural assets, as well as the governance systems in which they operate, and also the cultural aspects of the location as well. Then to develop a vision and action plan for the city. The City Water Resilience approach was co-developed with CIWI, the Resilient Cities Network, WRI, the World Bank and the Resilient Shift. And although the city's the convening force in this instance, the City Water Resilience approach recognises that cities are intrinsically linked to their catchment, and therefore we strive to have representation in the workshops from across the catchment, from national, regional, local government, utilities, river basin management authorities, NGOs, the community crucially, agriculture and businesses. And through a series of workshops, largely over a kind of month period, we worked together to understand some of the challenges, understand the maturity of the system, and develop a resilience action plan. As I mentioned, in Addis, the CWA was led by the Chief Resilience Officer with the Addis Ababa Water and Sewerage Authority. And the outcome is 9 vision statements and associated actions, crucially identifying who leads and supports the delivery of those actions. The second example I wanted to talk through was the World Bank's Ethiopia Water Resilience Diagnostic, which deploys at a country scale. And this complements the city water resilience approach. Its purpose is the development of a roadmap of clear strategic investment priorities that build resilience to climate change. It adopts a decision-making under deep uncertainty approach, and starts with this national overview of water resources. Then it moves to a vulnerability analysis, again at a catchment scale, to identify investment priorities, focusing particularly on improvements to supply and demand. Again, it's participatory in its nature, with the water resource modelling ground truth with stakeholders, and participatory decision-making on interventions, bringing together workshops of people to say, well, these are the options, which are the most beneficial from a holistic perspective across the catchment. In Ethiopia, it was carried out with the Ministry of Water and Environment, again with the support of Addis Ababa Water and Sewerage Authority. And the work resulted in providing adaptive pathways or roadmaps, which remain flexible to the ever-changing demands and climate change effects. In this instance, crucially, stakeholders underwent training to understand the models that had been used to develop these solutions so that they could use them in the longer term. The diagram on the screen represents the preferred portfolio. It's about £2.4 billion worth of investment. And to get there, we assessed the performance of the water system under 60,000 possible futures. So what have we learned from these two approaches? The first is an obvious but crucial message. Participatory approaches are essential for the successful planning and delivery of a climate-resilient future. They need to involve the actors on the screen. It's a wide variety and diverse set of actors that need to be involved in those discussions. But there are some particularly key lessons in the success of such approaches. Strong local convening is essential. We've worked with the City Resilience Officer, the Ministry, AUSA. That provides us with a strong and a long-term stable organisation to deliver the plans and carry them on into the future. You need good understanding of the local context, physical, natural, governance and cultural. A strong sense of local ownership, starting with a shared understanding of the challenges. And solutions need to come in partnership with capacity building. Otherwise, they can end up stranded, unable to move forwards, and not clear what the future is about. So in conclusion, participatory decision-making is key in the development of urban water resilience planning and delivery over the long term. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Louise. And next up, I'd like to call on Audrey Legat, who is the Senior Advisor, Water Governance at Deltares. Please.
Thank you, Anton, and good morning to all. Wait, how can I change the slides? Oh yeah, perfect. Yeah, so indeed I'm working at Deltares on water governance. I'm also part of the Water Peace and Security Partnership. And this session is about urban water resilience for peace and security. So I was quite willing to reflect also on this, on those last words. What does it mean also for peace and security? And when I started thinking about what am I going to focus on for today, I was actually in touch with the local partners that we work with in West Africa and more specifically in Mali. We have seen the case of Kenya, but at the moment there are also huge floodings going on through all West Africa, and the city of Bamako is specifically affected. And they were just sharing also some news articles and so on. And one of them really caught my attention, and I really thought, like, here we find some key aspects also that I actually wanted to reflect upon during this session. It is in French, but I have it also translated, and there are some key aspects that I will look at. The first one is really the fact that they mention the link also with the situation in the region, the link with terrorism, jihadism, and the fact that it is important that populations that are already in a fragile situation are not confronted also with urban resilient challenges. The second one, and I found it really interesting also to read in such an article in the media, says that climate change, scientists believe that climate change explains the rise in temperature and heavy rainfall, and obviously we know that climate change is bringing challenges, but also saying like it is also linked to urban management actually, and I think this is also an important key point. And the last one is also the need to take appropriate measures, which we will all agree upon, obviously. So what I thought that we can learn from it and what are key elements for urban water resilience is also this complex interaction between water and conflict. I think in many cases we are also sort of encouraged to think that, you know, with climate change and with rising conflict or water-related risks, that it will lead to an increase in conflict and tensions. And obviously there are water-related risks that are increasing with urbanization, demographic growth, economical growth, climate change, as I mentioned, but more as exacerbating also the other challenges. But also weak governance. So indeed we see an increase in water-related risks. But with the partnership and with other partners, we also try to really, you know, maybe tackle this idea, general perception of a direct link between risks related to water and the risk of conflict. And if I may, even in the description of this session, there was a statement that it becomes clear that the lack of access to water may lead or will lead to or be a catalyst for unrest and tension. But let's be careful also with this direct link. Actually, in the research that we do and also in the studies that we conduct, we see that this link is far from being direct, is much more complex. Of course, there are some situations where it will create some tension or reinforce some tensions, but it doesn't always lead to conflict. It doesn't always lead to violent situations. And basically water is also not, or usually not the only trigger for tensions. So just to put that in perspective, and I think also as it was highlighted in the previous presentation, it calls also for a real good understanding of the system and adopting a global view also of the system to really try to understand what happens at the moment that we introduce a change in this system, and especially in more fragile contexts, so that we do not create new problems by trying to tackle only one aspect of the whole system. So I fully align also with your key messages that system understanding and preferably also participative system understanding is really something that helps also in urban management. And actually in most cases, or in many cases, we see that water is a powerful entry point also to create more cooperation, to create more peaceful management. And I believe it is something that is important to keep in mind also when you urban planners or working also in such settings are, you know, recommending also interventions. And the last point I wanted to mention is this aspect. I don't know if you have seen on the first slide, but there was a question also related to the floodings in Bamako. Whose fault is it? Is it from governments? Is it from the municipalities, or is it from ourselves? And I found it really interesting that they asked this question as such also in the media. And I would say that it really calls also for a multi-level governance approach. The cities really have a role to play in tackling the challenges, the local people as well. And we don't see that happening so much. We're also mentioning that cities do not always have a role in managing the catchment. This is something that Deltares has worked on together with many of the co-organizers of this session, trying to also better understand the multi-level governance. To me, what was really striking when we brought that also to a global event was really the willingness also to from cities and national government to engage with each other. So I was really pleased to see that. And at Deltares, we really try to bring that further by integrating also multi-level governance better in the water management frameworks that we have, such as water as leverage and different frameworks like EPIC, for instance. But I will not go into detail, and I'm sure that other colleagues here today will go deeper in this aspect of multi-level governance. So, the importance of understanding the system, preferably participatory, and this a crucial aspect of linking government, municipalities, and people. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Audrey. Let's move right along with our next speaker. That's Helen Wanjoy-Opal, who's the Climate and Engagement Lead for Cities in Africa for WRI. Please. It's the green button for forwards.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you again to CIWI for the invite, to ICLE, sorry, for the invite for today's session. As we began to frame the issue of urban water resilience, we wanted to bring in the voices of the people who often are at the front line of climate losses induced by water-related risks, and that's why you listen to the video today. And that's why our focus today is how do we ensure that even as we speak, as we plan, that we ensure that we embed inclusivity within our planning processes. Who are the least included when we speak about cities? For a lot of cities, these are people who are the urban poor, and in many instances live in low-income informal settlements. We have about 2 in every 3 people living in informal settlements, particularly in the low-income countries, an estimated 1.5 billion people. And when we come to Africa, the figures are similar, 2 in 3 people in a lot of geographies that live within these informal settlements. But over and beyond those people, there are even disproportionate vulnerabilities within these urban poor communities themselves. We have people who are disabled, we have climate migrants, we have refugees, we have so many levels and layers of vulnerabilities even within our cities. So how do we ensure that these people are within these rooms as we speak, as we plan? I hope it's moving. Yes. So what are the impacts of when we exclude? Today we wanted to bring you the case of Nairobi, and as Anton said, this case is very similar to a lot of African countries and a lot of cities within the global south. In April of this year, massive flooding, as you saw, hit the city of Nairobi and other cities and regions within the country of Kenya. And that, as you can see, was some of the impacts. The people at the front line directly linked with the hotspot areas, predominantly the steep slopes, riparian areas, and those were photos of the actual losses that happened. But what happens? Nature, and we know climate change is changing, and it's very hard. You know, we know the uncertainties of climate change. But what is certain is how we react as planners, as governments, as institutions, as civil society. That is something we can control. In the case of Kenya, the government of Kenya adopted what it felt was an evacuation approach, where it decided to remove the informal settlements in what was considered the highest risk area, the ones that had been the highest hit. But as a result of making a decision without including these communities, most of these people did not receive compensation. A lot of these structures, people had nowhere to go to. As a result, investments that had been made by these communities themselves and partners in the form of like wash infrastructure, water points, toilets, community schools were destroyed as a result. And what was viewed as an evacuation, approach that did not involve the people then exacerbated the humanitarian crisis within these communities, widening that inequality gap. And as we have begun to see from the data that we've been collecting, and WRI is running together with local partners a lot of riparian dialogues, there's an increase in gender-based violence. People have had to move in together with people they didn't know. So a lot of mental stress, a lot of need of social support. And so we are saying that the impact of excluding is extremely high. So what are the pathways of potentially including when we are planning for water within our cities? One, I think you heard from the video, these communities have agency, they have solutions, they have vision, even as they are the frontline communities themselves. We must begin to meaningfully, so it's not just about participation, but it must be meaningful, informed, active participation of these communities to co-create not just the solutions, but even the data itself that informs the solutions that we will develop as a first pathway. This is a map co-developed by WRI together with Slum Dwellers International. You will be shocked that before the flooding hit Nairobi, the communities themselves had actually been mapping what they felt was the flood risk. And when overlaid, it really was immensely similar with what the communities themselves had envisioned would be the extent of the rivers. So what does that tell you? That there's an excess of even what science itself can prove and what the communities know through their local knowledge and lived experiences when interacting with climate disasters in the case of water here. Number two, we must be alive that context matters, and we must integrate local customs, local solutions. At WRI, we are running a project called Scaling Urban Nature-Based Solutions in Sub-Saharan Africa, and this is the city of Dire Dawa in Ethiopia. So acknowledging what's happening there, the local customs, what do we need to do as we develop solutions that aligns so that we can ensure there's long-term sustainability. The third one, finance. Finance in itself is not a solution if it's not the right type of finance and doesn't flow the right way. And particularly getting to these local communities to empower them to be part of the co-creation of the solution, implementation, but also long-term management and operationalization of the solutions that we develop. I think the figures already speak for themselves in terms of how little money goes to Africa, to cities, but even less goes to these local communities themselves. And so we must do better and begin to scale the best-in-class solutions when it comes to financing. The last piece, if we do not institutionalize inclusion, embedding it within the things that outlive city leadership cycle, political cycles, government cycles, ensuring that we embed this within our policies, but also embed local governance structures within this institutionalization to ensure that it outlives us, but also critically as we institutionalize the power of partnerships, because as you heard from the speakers before, the challenge is layered and requires what we had, a multi-level approach, multiple stakeholders, different levels being included. And that means the local communities matter as well. Thank you, Anton.
Great. Thank you very much, Helen, for that example over there, very vividly presented. Our final speaker in this segment, may I call on Ms. Åsa Johnson, who's the head of the Global Water Operators Partnership Alliance. Thank you, Åsa.
Okay, excellent. Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Italy, for inviting the Global Water Operator Partnership Alliance, known as GWOPA, to be here. Firstly, just briefly, who we are. We are a global alliance of over 150 institutional members today, who is facilitated by UN Habitat. So I'm also here in that way representing UN Habitat. What I will bring to what's already a very rich panel discussion here is the focus and the constituency that we work with in our alliance, which are water and sanitation utilities. And what we are specialized in is in capacity building of utilities and also advocacy for how important they are as urban actors in the whole area around achieving both SDG 6 and SDG 11 as well within the mandate that UN Habitat holds. And I don't think I need to go into the details here. I think most of us are familiar with the water sector, but this is really sort of the role that we play in elevating the voice of utilities in the work that we're doing. The theme here today, we're looking at how do strong utilities support peace and security. I would very much agree with what our panelist from it was one of our colleagues here who said that I don't think we should jump to the conclusion around water insecurity and conflict. And I was also consulting with our team in preparation for this event that I don't think we would make an immediate argument that strong utilities create peace, or weak utilities create insecurity, rather. But of course, it's clear that a very fundamental role utilities play to make sure that there is service delivery, and that ultimately that creates a more peaceful situation both within settlements, because there can be conflicts in terms of access of water within settlements themselves when people get desperate for water and sanitation, and of course in a more regional role as well. So what we're doing, just a moment on this, and what we're contributing really to the discussion here, is focusing on what is known as water operator partnerships. And these are twinnings between utilities, and we call it, the language we like to use is eye-to-eye partnerships, where it's usually longer term for a few years, in a spirit of solidarity between, for a lack of a better terminology, a mentor utility and a mentee utility in strengthening different capacities that they work on. I would actually like to say, and this brings in a nice dimension to this, that there's an element of peace building in that itself. In terms of, we experience a lot of interest from mentor utilities that do this very much on a solidarity basis of understanding other cultures, what's the incentives for the time being spent in water operator partnerships. And I would argue that that contributes to peace in a different dimension, perhaps beyond what we're talking about here. So what we like to do is to increase these water operator partnerships. It's proven to be a very efficient way of working, and to scale them up. Just a quick glance here on the scope and on the countries that and regions that we're working in. At the moment, there's close to 50 water operator partnerships ongoing. There's the figures here represent the number of engagements in different countries across the continents that have been in a WOP over the years, because we also manage a database of all different water operator partnerships. So back again a little bit to what we do. I mean, we operationally do this twinning between institutions, but we're also serving as a sort of know-how place in terms of how to best strengthen such partnerships. And of course, one of the topics that come up very strongly here is around climate resilience. This is something that we're working more and more on. How can we strengthen the work that utilities do on being climate resilient? How can we strengthen their know-how around nature-based solutions, etc. So we serve also as a knowledge for how such partnerships are capturing these elements in capacity building over time. We have recently developed sanitation strategy, and I'm highlighting that here because we notice that when we get into water operator partnerships in the sanitation, this often involves more complex sets of actors in the partnership itself. And for those interested in it, I've just put the strategy here and happy to share more information on that. Just to show, for example, this is where we really get into multi-actor partnerships, looking at, a partnership between a utility and another, but also looking at who are the actors in the municipality, the regulators, etc., in terms of the enabling environment for such a utility to pick up the capacity building and really be able to deliver on the learnings that they're getting from their mentor organization. In terms of just a few examples, because probably I just have a minute or two, here I've just shown one just to make it a little bit more sort of come alive to you, which is one of the water operator partnerships that we're doing in Kenya, funded by the EU. And I was there just recently, and it's really rewarding to see how Kiwasco and Kisumu City, this is a South-South water operator partnership, is mentoring others within Kenya and hoping now to graduate into being a super mentor and mentoring others beyond. The focus is very much on service delivery for informal settlements, setting up low-income units, and we're seeing really good results in this water operator partnership. And I wanted to end with just a few more examples because I wanted to flag here what are some of the areas we're also working on in water operator partnerships when it comes to addressing climate. So, for example, we have, just to throw out some of the topics to give a bit of flavor to this, on implementing and managing climate resilient infrastructure. We have a WOP right now between a utility in Milan in Italy and in Tunisia, and also between Dresden in Germany and Zambia. In the area of improving monitoring and climate modeling, we're working in Nepal with a Swedish utility Vakien in Umeå. And then we are covering areas like ensuring equitable access to water services for vulnerable populations. That's taking place in this WOP, but also in Sierra Leone. Promoting institutional capacity and climate leadership, which is a bit of a more management aspect we're working on in South Africa. And disseminating climate-smart technical solutions, which is also becoming more and more part of our work in terms of using digitalization. We have a very good partnership with VEI in Netherlands and in Tanzania and Mwanza. You had mentioned in the beginning around catchment management areas. This is also something that we have in one of our EU programs and something that a number of our partners is also covering. So I think I'll just end there for now, and yeah. Those of you who can, please do join us in our assembly in Cairo.
Thank you. And stay on stage, because I'm going to ask all of the panelists to come and join us on stage over here. And now's your chance to face a few questions. Do we actually have any questions? Does anyone want to ask any of the panelists anything? Because I've certainly got a few, and I can launch with those. But if we've got some on the floor, it'll actually be great. Okay, I see a question back over there, so let me hand you the mic. And if I could just ask that you introduce yourself and the organization that you represent.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Martin Findlay. I'm based at Arup, but working in Peru at the moment on a large infrastructure program with the government. And I was really interested in WRI's presentation especially, where we saw those informal settlements on the banks of the rivers. And it's something I've seen working in a lot of countries around the world, is even when people know there's a flood risk, people still, live in those areas. Often it's because people don't have access elsewhere. But just wondering, how can we support governments to maybe protect those areas a little bit better? Because often there's planning restrictions around building in those areas. Often there's restrictions around protecting the riparian zone, but it's just not enforced. So how can we maybe help support governments do that?
And was that for Helen?
Yes. For Helen and also anyone else who wants to chip in.
Helen, do you want to start and we can pick it up then?
Yeah, excellent question, Martin. And I think that's the complexity of why we say it's completely layered, because as you said, it's a confluence of people that are poor and have no option. Rather than stay there. It's a governance challenge because government allows, in a lot of African countries, looks the other way and sometimes enables the settlement of people within these high-risk zones. We have tools like planning. I think that really strong pathways to begin to protect these areas, but in a lot of cases are not enforced. So, for instance, Kenya doesn't have a planning problem. It has an enforcement problem and a governance challenge. So it's multi-layered and really, I think something, if you go actually to these communities themselves, you begin to see solutions that they have themselves done. We have areas along the rivers of Nairobi where the communities themselves have reclaimed former areas that were waste sites or certain parts of the river, reclaimed them, done nature-based solutions, done community parks. So how do we support even these local communities themselves to scale? So that's why we are saying it's so multi-layered, and I think the support that partners can give, I think, is to contribute within that multi-layered process, but ensuring and fighting for inclusion for all stakeholders, not just the communities themselves. Government has a really key role, and again, capacitating it, but also holding some sense of accountability, because a lot of these challenges, as I said, also have, government also plays a role. Thanks.
I like that quote of yours over there, Helen. Kenya doesn't have
Yes.
policy problem, you have an enforcement problem. So not a governance problem, but enforcement. And I think that really comes to the nub of multi-level governance, because of course it's probably a different entity responsible for enforcement compared to the governance structures. Can I move around in the audience? Who else would like to pose a question? Okay, great. Go ahead, please introduce yourself and proceed.
Okay, thank you. My name is Muturi Kamoyo. I come from Kenya, so it's fun to see what Helen is presenting. I also know the area. But I'm also intrigued actually also with Arab. Yeah. I was impressed also the same discussion of multi-layered approach and stakeholders, but I was also curious how also for your case in Ethiopia, how it was organized, because it seems you have all these different partners, and how do you build the social system for them to interact, because I'm imagining the religion and the academic, they all have different roles, and that's also what we see in Kenya, like they all, but what is the example that you can share?
Yeah, sure, great question. I mean, with the, if I maybe touch particularly on the city water resilience approach, because I think that's an approach that is largely kind of participatory and qualitative by its nature. It doesn't, it doesn't have the element of large data analysis that the other project has, and so it relies essentially, the decision making in that it relies on getting different views and having conversations around those views in the catchment, and so we are heavily dependent on the local partner. We are heavily dependent on making sure that there's a value proposition for people to come to these workshops. The way that the process works is that we usually run kind of 2 to 3 series of workshops over the course of the development of the action plan to bring kind of views together. The first section is about bringing people together to understand the system. The second section is bringing people together to look at the resilience vulnerabilities of that system. And then the third is about kind of developing the vision and the action plan. And we have tables of people who are technical in their nature, have a kind of social justice element to bring to the discussion, represent their local communities, and they all come together and have an equal voice in the discussions, and I think that's what's so important. There are, really small practical implications of that. So, what time do you run workshops in the day to enable people to travel from communities that are more remote? Some of the practical, do you have simultaneous translation on site so that everybody does truly have an equal voice? And I think there's quite a lot of work done up front with the local partner to map who should be involved in those workshops, and to really kind of reach out to make sure that they feel welcome and invited to come and participate as well. So it's not a fast process necessarily to get all that set up, but it's an important process.
Maybe I'll pick up on that a bit, because it's interesting that point, Helen, you also made that point more or less in your presentation. You said you spoke about the institutionalization of participation. I think it was the 4th point you called for. But very often when you speak to planners and you say, well, you need to have a robust public participation process, they'll quickly say, well, then you're going to get caught up in a very delayed decision-making process, and we're going to be having discussions, and we need to deliver. We need to show communities we're actually building infrastructure, we're actually taking action. How do you reconcile that when there's the need to actually progress rapidly because there's such a huge need, but participation processes take long and cost money?
I'm happy to take that one. And I think one of the biggest strengths we have found is you cannot build trust overnight, and that's okay. But that's why you must partner with organizations that have been embedded within those communities for a really long time, so that you can carry along that trust that they have with the local communities. Across the cities in Africa, we work in 7 countries and 11 cities. We begin to work really closely with partner organizations that are embedded and have invested decades of time and effort and work with these communities and so are trusted. We work very closely with Slum Dwellers International. Kenya, for instance. In Rwanda, we work with the Association of Genocide Widows, so who have worked really closely with that community for many years and have the trust. In Johannesburg, we work with the Alexandra Water Warriors, representing the community of one of the informal settlements there. So, and this cuts across our geographies. And so you have to acknowledge that you may not have that trust, but there are people that have that trust with those communities, and how to move the process along a bit faster, I think, is to leverage and the strong partnerships that can come up. But I think many people view participation as a nuisance, and rightly, as you said, that delays the process. But I think it truly is a pointer to the mode of operation and how we don't view the power of partnerships with those that have, the ability to move processes along slightly faster. Thanks.
I'll open it to the floor again. Any other hands? Right at the back. Great.
Hi, my name's Abby. I'm from New Zealand and a company called Aquawatch. Just going back into that conversation around how participation can sometimes block progress, an observation that we've seen in a few projects in New Zealand, notably the personifying of a river in the Whanganui River, was actually the blockers came because people tried to talk to symptoms rather than causes. So not necessarily it's finding that base core and shared value. And it's not really a question, but it's more sort of, what are your observations on that in the spaces that you work in? How do you actually engage quicker and faster to find those shared beliefs and values that move things forward?
That sounds like an interesting question. I'd like to, could you give us an example of what you're saying here about how the symptoms are not addressed so that our speakers can respond?
Yeah, I think maybe in the session I was in earlier, people were saying that there are competing priorities in terms of water management. So you're talking about people who want to be able to discharge certain things, different requirements in regards to water take, for example. And if you start talking at that level, then what we've seen is you have a lot of arguments because people disagree. So how do you get down to a base level, which is what is the shared value? Quite often that comes down to safe water. Everyone wants safe, usable water. And that can sometimes give a faster entry point. So I suppose that's my example, but yeah, really interested in what you think.
Who would like to? Audrey, please go ahead.
Yeah, perhaps I can answer this one. Thanks for the question. Yeah, one of the approach that we have actually used to get to the symptoms, but also the causes, is one of participatory methodologies also, where we actually suggested the local participants via our local partners that moderated the whole process to work on what we call a causal loop diagram, and it's really a deconstruction of the system. It is something that is often used by experts to have an understanding of the system, but here is really to take the time to also create with local stakeholders, like what is the system that they are in actually. I mean, it's not really fast to do. We have applied it in several countries, and it took, in average, about 7 months with regular meetings, bilateral meetings, and so on. But we got really interesting results of that in creating trust and in really going also into the roots of the problem, but also in understanding like how is an intervention also spreading along the whole system. It was also interesting in aligning in a sort of terminology. In one of the cases, for instance, there was at some point sort of, a difficult discussion also related to water access. And going a bit deeper into understanding what they meant with this factor in the system, we understood that they were actually talking about different things, like do you have access to water, is the quality of water good enough, and so on. And then we could really, also align better on the terminology. So this is one of the approaches that we have used, and I think that can, better come to distinguishing the symptoms and causes. But it's not fast, it takes time. I fully agree also with Ellen. And I think we have to acknowledge that also in other situations, that in Africa, also in Europe, it takes time to really come to a proper management of the system.
Audrey, I like that response because I think that ties in with what you were saying in your presentation. The simplistic question of whether water scarcity, climate change leads to conflict, and your response is, well, it's complicated. And it's a system, and you change one aspect of a system, and it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen in the rest of that system, definitely. I'd like to also hear after we hear a bit more about how this plays out in the utility complex, your water operators. That would be very interesting.
Yeah.
And then I'll also turn to getting some online questions to be read out. But go ahead also.
Thank you. No, maybe I can first react a bit on this aspect of building trust. And I mean, in the realm of what we work on, that's one of the aspects that we see really functions in these water operator partnerships, because it takes a long time to build that trust. So the opposite of this would be to fly in a consultant to fix whatever needs to be fixed and get out, right? So it requires an exposure and trust in the vulnerability of the issue to really solve it together. So I think it's a longer term approach that we take to partnership building, including in how utilities work on participation issues and management, transparency, integrity, corruption. I mean, sensitive topics. This takes a long time to have a good relationship with the mentor. Another comment I just wanted to sort of add on to is that we are recognizing more and more in the work that we do that we can't only focus on building the capacity of a utility in a vacuum, right? I mean, of course, there's the whole financial aspects, and we're working a lot with utilities on how they can become investment ready and manage finances, etc. There's also the regulatory framework and so forth. So we are really, at the moment, expanding our work, and it's a discussion, we're also early discussions with ICLE, in terms of really strengthening that part of how we support utilities as well.
Louise, I know you want to make a point, but I'm going to just
go to the questions, Anton, absolutely.
Our online participants, and of course to reaffirm that they're all very welcome to send us questions. So please, Megan, could you share with us?
Great, thank you. Yeah, there's a couple of questions coming in from the chat, so I'll just group some of those together. One of those is, what are the panelists' views on which local stakeholder should have the longer-term responsibility to ensure that multi-stakeholders are continue to be participating and embedded within these processes? Too often it stops once the partners or consultants leave or a project ends. So kind of touching on the long-term responsibilities there and how to ensure collaboration. And then another...
Should we deal with them one by one?
Sure. There's one related question that kind of just asks how community-based organizations can be more effectively integrated into this multi-level governance strategies to address urban water resilience.
And does it say who's asking the questions?
Yes, so that question, first one was from Sandra from SNV and also from Benitez in Kenya.
Great, well those are two great questions. Certainly something to be thinking about in terms of the community participation on the second one, but then also the sustainability of these participation processes. And again, I think all of you have actually touched on that. It wasn't addressed at anyone in particular, but Louise, I know you're at a point. Could you speak to this? And then I'll invite the other three panelists to reflect on that.
And maybe if I'll pick up the long-term sustainability question, and I might hand to panelists for the community organisations. So in terms of the kind of who should hold the local stakeholder responsibilities for the long term, I think it's whoever's well connected, whoever's got potentially a local political or social mandate to move it forwards. We've had experience of things like the city water resilience approach being led by all sorts of different partners, from academia through to the local authorities, through to national government. And in each instance, the key to the success, both in the planning stage but also the delivery, was purely the commitment and connections of the organisation that was hosting it. And so I would hate to put one organisation as the person who had a responsibility. I think our governance contexts in water are so different around the world. And so I really think it comes to the characteristics of the organisation, those that are have enthusiasm and purpose in this space, and those who have the kind of good local community-based connections to bring in a diverse set of voices.
Louise, if I can follow up on that a little bit. So what you're saying is that in many cases, it's not necessarily an organization that's mandated to do the participation. It's more a question of organizations that are willing to do it, are capable of doing it, and are well connected. And that's really that's all you need.
I mean, I think the mandate is important, but I think where we see success is the characteristics of the organisation that kind of is motivated, drives the purpose, is well connected, and often we find that partnering those two organisations together is a great way to kind of get through. So working with for example, a local government or utility in partnership with an organisation. So for example, we often see the city resilience officer working with a local utility. And so there you've got the partnership of the resilience officer, who's usually got quite good connections from a convening perspective, and the local local utility, who has the kind of mandate around water and sewerage.
Helen.
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Sandra. And from my perspective, I don't view I don't think the answer is any local stakeholder specifically. I think it has to be a mix because it has to have the local communities, it has to have government, like I said, which has a key and strong role, I think, in ensuring that these things happen. It has to have, a mix of the planning and enforcement agencies. There has to be budget for it. And so from my view, in some instances, and that's why I talked about institutionalization, there is the strength in institutionalizing. For some instances, if it's like in Kenya, they've formed the Nairobi Rivers Commission, for instance, just acknowledging that this issue is so complex that there must be an institution, incorporating a lot of these stakeholders for long-term sustainability and allocating budget resources that are required, and even, formal mandate to do that. In some instances, if it's a smaller project, we might do what back home, there's a project that has what we call settlement executive committee, right? It's just a committee that has community members elected by the community themselves, includes local administration representatives, it includes the local politician, and then it includes someone from the government ministry and someone from the city level. So I think it depends with the level and scale of the project, the complexity and who the stakeholders are. But I do think there's a lot of strength in ensuring we institutionalize, to some level, and acknowledging the local structures that exist and the scale of the project. So I don't think it's one local stakeholder. I think it's a complete mishmash, of many of them. Thanks.
Audrey, in your presentation, you spoke about the example of Bamako, where there was flooding, and the newspapers were questioning, saying, well, whose fault is it? Is it national government? Is it the municipal government? Or is it us? And I guess that's the local residents. Do you want to reflect on this discussion and how those questions played out in the media there?
Yeah. I very much agree that it is case by case. Something that we sometimes do also, and it usually works well, is also via the local partners to identify some persons that are particularly well connected and also from different organizations, but that will be really committed also to the purpose of the project, and that will be able to actually, together with the local partners, moderate the whole process and guide the whole process. And they are usually not so difficult to find and to really get engaged on the long term. And then at the very beginning of the project, we would discuss also how do they want support from international partners and how is a bit the role division. And I think that really ensures also that this is led by local people with backup also to develop tools, methodologies, and so on, but also ensuring some sustainability in the long run, because when they are committed also to guide this whole process, they will take it along also for the next project or for the next process. So this is something that, that we usually also use for more sustainability and for stakeholder engagement, but it's very much case by case.
And also, I mean, the water operators, the utilities that you are interfacing with and working with, I mean, is this part of their way of working? Is this something that you see, you speak of mentor and mentee utilities there? Is this a topic that comes up, this public participation, and what sort of innovation are you starting to see amongst your partners?
No, definitely. It's a big topic, and it's one that a lot of the utilities that we're engaging with are looking for good practice in working on. I mean, I see a couple of ways in this part. One is how to consult with the wider community in terms of certain changes that they're doing in services, etc. I'll give an example in a moment, but also in terms of their whole customer service approach and how they're accessible. So this is not now to a whole participatory group, but even on an individual basis, how receptive are they, how efficient is it? I mean, this is one of the main complaints often utilities get from customers. So we work a lot on the customer service units and also on the on generally outreach. So just to give one example from Uganda, where we're working with National Water in Uganda, they were introducing in one of the settlements by Kampala, a new water collection point with a very new meter that is quite hard to understand. But they had spent a lot of time with a lot of pride in how to sensitize the whole community to this. You know, it was a very good example, we're sharing of that. One of their takeaways was also to make sure to have smaller water collection, you know, because many children were coming, they were too heavy, it wasn't possible. The meter was for like 2 liters and it was too heavy. So this is just a concrete example how you then listen to the community. They were very proud to share that, change the metering, enable it to be the half collection, and just make this possible in that particular community in Kampala. So these are the kind of things that we celebrate and like to share, you know, also with South-South collaboration that we're doing with Uganda.
In a moment, I'm going to be coming for a last round of questions to the floor. But one thing that's really struck me also in your presentation, you spoke about these partnerships and a mentor and a mentee. And I think what you hinted at was that sometimes that relationship changes. So a water utility that's maybe there as the more kind of the learning position, maybe over time starts sharing. Is that a typical trajectory that you see over time?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's a big discussion point in our membership, and if anyone has better terminology than mentor and mentee, the poll is open. We keep discussing it and we settle back on these terms because somehow we haven't found another one. But really, it's not correct formulation because it's a two-way learning, and we see that all the time. And it's often the so-called mentor utility takes away a lot of learning from the utility. And this is partly the beauty of these water operator partnerships, because that's what keeps their staff wanting to be involved and put extra time into this. This is how this model works, because of the learnings that they get. So we definitely see that over time. We also see the transitioning where a so-called, now lack of better word, mentee utility gets empowered, likes the peer-to-peer approach, and applies to become a mentor themselves. You know, this is great because this is how we scale up. This is how we empower utilities. They want to play that role. So we see more and more over time this, and it's a trend, of course, that we're also supporting.
That's a great indicator of sustainability if I've ever heard of one. Wonderful. Please go.
Thanks for this. It's a really great session. I'm Heather Skilling. I'm with USAID Fragile Waters Project. And we've heard a lot about the power of the participatory process and also the strength of some of these planning exercises, including allocation of roles and responsibilities. I'm wondering if we could come back to that question of enforcement, though. and accountability, regulation. I'm just wondering if any of the panelists have some comments on what they've seen in terms of a successful, I don't know, relationship between external enforcement and accountability versus this investment in the front-end process on the participatory side.
Tough question from Heather. Which of the panelists are interested in delving deeper onto that topic? Helen, I'm sure this came a bit from your presentation, so I'm looking at you a bit.
Yeah, Heather, really tough question, I think, but this is my perspective. For a lot of projects, you know, a lot of institutions exit when the grant period ends, and a lot of times it's hard to keep track 20 years down the line whether what you kicked off is actually working. I'll use an example that's not a WRI, example, and it's actually not water-based. It's an informal settlement upgrading initiative that was adopted in Kenya that was aimed at resolving the land tenure issues. And like I said, that in that particular instance, they have tried to do the community structures of governance that are supposed to outlive and ensure that something, works in the long term. Like I said, that had the communities, the politician, the local admin, and all that. But I think one of the challenges that we have seen within that framework has been that sometimes these structures end up becoming barriers and gatekeepers themselves, in the long term. And I think that's perhaps why the question is extremely hard to answer, is that we normally are unable to monitor really long term, but we also have seen cases where what are ideally good situations, morphing again into structures, that then hinder again, more robust participation. So I think that's why it has to be really continuous re-examination of the success of the approach. So a really robust M&E evaluation, again, that includes the communities themselves and all the stakeholders. Yeah.
This is really turning into an interesting discussion, and I'm kind of getting the feeling it is that typical thing that we take a bit of time to build up the discussion, and then once you've got momentum going, then it's full steam ahead. However, we are running out of time. So I am going to, at this point, say let's give a big round of applause to our wonderful panel over here and say thank you very much. So there were certainly some interesting and common themes coming through in the discussion over here and in the presentation, which was great. And we had our panelists, and you would have noted that we on purpose didn't have anything called a keynote speaker, because we wanted all the panelists to be on an equal footing to share their wonderful wealth of experience. However, we are fortunate in that we've got a keynote listener. August, may I please welcome you to the stage. August is busy studying his PhD at the University of Montpellier, and I feel it's really interesting to have an expert, a young expert, you're relatively new to the sector, and we'd like to hear a bit about you, to share his opinion on the discussion that's gone on now. So August, please, can I hand over to you for 5 minutes?
Thank you, Anton. So the presentation of the diverse panelists were very insightful, and I learned a lot from those presentations. But my main takeaway is that it's important to increase the sense of ownership of the communities regarding the actions that need to be taken in order to address the diverse impact of climate change on the urban water systems. And even if it is very difficult to respond to that question, like whose faults is those impacts due to climate change, or whose responsibilities are those diverse impacts, we can all give a response to who will suffer the most from those consequences. And I think it is the local communities, young people, and those living in those areas. So strengthening their capacity, strengthening the way they could respond to those impacts is very key. And I was very glad to witness that diverse cooperation organization are taking that road. So that is my main takeaways from the presentation of the diverse panelists. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, August. We really appreciate that reflection. I like the way you framed that, moving beyond fault, beyond responsibility, and saying where does the impact lie? And I think that maybe helps guide us in terms of where to look for solutions, because you look for solutions in relation to where that impact is being felt. So I really appreciate that insight from you. Thank you, and good luck with the remainder of your PhD.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, with that, I'm apparently on the schedule to close the session, but I don't think I have much more to add. We had a rich dialogue. At the beginning, I said I was hoping that we would actually hear about examples of where local governments, where municipalities, where cities have become engaged in more regional processes, and we heard about that. And I think beyond them just becoming engaged in regional processes, what I saw coming out of the session to a greater degree than what I had anticipated, and I should have maybe been alerted to that in the Menti poll, where the predominant answer was yes, cities are getting engaged in their catchments, is indeed that cities are actually planning around catchment management, but they do need some support in that. Not always technical support. We heard a lot more over here from the speakers around process support and the challenges around making sure a utility, for instance, is interfacing in an effective way with their consumers. You know, they might have a state-of-the-art water metering device that's doing its job, but it wasn't quite what the local consumers were wanting to have. And that's maybe where the process support is very important. And I think that's often what is missing in terms of the capacity building and the technical support that we are providing. So that's probably a function, of course, of the fact that we are looking at multi-level governance. So once you start talking about that, you are moving away from a monolithic approach to mandates and responsibilities and saying, well, it's actually a composite approach to mandate and responsibilities. So hearing even Louise, you're speaking about organizations that don't necessarily have a direct mandate, but taking on that responsibility and making sure that at the end of the day, the impacts that are being felt at local level are sustained, positive impacts in this case. So I'm going to say thank you to all of you as an audience. You've been great. It's really nice to get a lot of questions and a lot of interactions from all of you. And thank you to our panelists, and enjoy the rest of the World Water Week. Could we get a photo here of our panelists up on stage? August, please join us. Thank you.